Well, welcome to the EmpowerRx Pharmacist Group and other healthcare professionals. My name is Tim Ulbrich. I'm the co-founder and CEO of Your Financial Pharmacist, and providing you with a student loan repayment update. There's a lot of uncertainty. I'm recording this in the middle of March of 2025. So if you're watching this at a later point in time, keep in mind that there's a lot of things that are rapidly changing. I'll cover some of that here briefly in this short session. And more than anything, stay up to date with this information. Studentaid.gov is the place that you're going to want to go. We'll also try to keep our community at Your Financial Pharmacist up to date as the information comes out. So just some quick background. Hopefully it goes without saying that everyone's financial situation is different. So when we talk about student loans, that's one part of the financial plan, but it's just that. It's one part. And how you approach your student loans can depend on a lot of other things with your financial plan. And so my hope is as you hear this, it will motivate you to want to go learn more, figure out how this can fit into other parts of your financial plan. But this session is really meant to be educational in nature and is not intended to provide any type of advice that's specific to your situation. Now, where are we at as a profession when it comes to student loan debt? So I'll briefly talk through some of the background of student loans, some of the anatomy of student loans, and then I'll get into the current state of where we're at as it relates to student loan repayment options. As a profession, in pharmacy in particular, other healthcare professions, some are a little bit higher, some are a little bit lower, but we've been hovering right around $160,000 as the median debt load for a pharmacy graduate. And that data comes from the American Association Colleges of Pharmacy, AACP. They do a graduating student survey each year. And the most recent data we have is from the class of 2024. So we'll get the class of 2025 data here pretty soon. And one of the things you'll notice is that that median debt load, when you combine public and private schools, has actually been flattening off in the last several years. And as I mentioned, is hovering right around $160,000. We saw that peak in the pandemic above 170. And then I think because of, in part due to the administrative forbearance that came along with COVID, we've been seeing that come down because of what are typically unsubsidized federal loans during graduate school, like pharmacy school. Those were really treated as if they were subsidized because the interest was frozen on that during that forbearance period. So when we look at student loan repayment strategies at a high level, right, there are three main buckets that I want you to think about, and I want you to think about them from left to right. And I'll talk about the one that's probably of most interest to this group, which would be public service loan forgiveness. But to be complete, I'll cover all three. So left to right, tuition reimbursement, then forgiveness, and then non-forgiveness. And the idea is in bucket one and bucket two, tuition reimbursement and forgiveness, that if we can have someone else that will pay a portion or all the bill, we're at least going to evaluate that option further. Now, some of you may decide that you don't want to go that pathway for whatever reason. That's okay. But we at least want to rule that out and consider that. That would be tuition reimbursement forgiveness. Option three is non-forgiveness, aka you're going to pay it out of your own pocket. So when we look at tuition reimbursement, these are typically federal programs. There are some state programs that are available, but usually federal programs where in exchange for some type of service and years of service, you have a portion of your debt, sometimes all, but usually a portion of your debt that would be reimbursed. Right. So these would be things like the Education Debt Reduction Program, the EDRP through the VA, some of the military pharmacist positions that are out there, like the Navy Health Professions Loan Program, the Indian Health Service program would fall under here as well. Not a huge percentage of graduates, but for those that have it available or are pursuing that pathway in their career, you at least obviously want to be aware of that and potentially pursue that further. The second bucket, which I presume is most interesting to this group and is getting a lot of attention right now, is forgiveness. And there are two forgiveness options available under the federal loan system. There's public service loan forgiveness, known as PSLF, and there's non-public service loan forgiveness, which some other people call IDR forgiveness or income-driven repayment forgiveness. And I'll explain the difference between those two here in a moment. And then finally, whether it's because you have private loans or because you're not interested or aren't eligible for one of the previous options that I mentioned, that third bucket is non-forgiveness, meaning you're going to pay them off. And when it comes to your federal loans, you can either keep your loans in the federal system, or you always have an option to move them to another lender, a private lender, which would be a process of refinancing. Now, I'm not going to talk at length about refinancing today because I'm going to focus on the federal forgiveness strategies. But refinancing, although it doesn't have the role that it once did because of where interest rates are at and because of the benefits that are available inside of the federal system, there are still some borrowers where refinancing may make sense. And I'm thinking in particular, those of you that have private loans. So they're not federal right now. So there's no benefits that would be lost. Private loans at higher interest rate, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12%, that you might want to look at refinancing those to another private lender with the goal of reducing that interest rate. Now, let's talk about PSLF, what the difference is between non-PSLF, and then I'll talk about the current state of where we're at with student loans. Now, many of you are already familiar with these rules, but if not, there are several boxes that we have to check to be able to get to the finish line, if you will, when it comes to public service loan forgiveness. You have to work for the right type of employer. This is a 501c3 nonprofit or a federal government agency or organization. So the majority of pharmacists that we see pursue public service loan forgiveness, they fall into that 501c3 nonprofit, right? Hospital health systems, some academics, but about 80% of all hospital health systems are nonprofit. That's the largest group. We certainly do see pharmacists that work for the federal government agency or organization bucket. That would be VA, FDA, NIH, CDC. But for the most part, it's those that are working for that 501c3 nonprofit. That's the first rule that we have to follow, if you will. The second thing is you have to have the right kind of loan. That's a direct loan. So not all federal loans are created equal. So sometimes we have to first consolidate our loans into a direct loan so that then that does qualify as an eligible loan towards PSLF. You have to be in the right kind of repayment plan. We'll talk about that. And there's some questions around that in the moment. You have to make the right number of payments. That's 120 payments, 10 years worth of payments. You cannot make them faster. They do not have to be consecutive and they do not have to be with the same employer. But 120, essentially, think of these as credits. We have to make 120 qualifying payments to get 120 credits, and then we can unlock that public service loan forgiveness, which ultimately is that tax-free forgiveness. And that's the main differentiator between PSLF and non-PSLF or IDR forgiveness. There are some other differences you want to be aware of. Now, most of you that are watching, I believe, are going to be working for a PSLF qualifying employer, but some of you might end up working for a for-profit. We see this a lot with, some hospital pharmacists that work for a for-profit, not a large group. Some pharmacists that work in industry, pharmacists that work in chain pharmacy, right? So for those that aren't PSLF eligible because of who they work for, they might be thinking about that other forgiveness option, which is not as beneficial, but is an option out there. Now, there are three main differences between public service and non-public service loan forgiveness. One is the timeline to forgiveness. One is ultimately who you work for. And then the third one is how the taxes are treated on that forgiveness. So timeline to forgiveness. PSLF, we already established 120 is that minimum number, 10 years worth of payments. Non-PSLF is typically 20 to 25 years. The second bucket of who you work for, we already established PSLF has to be that qualifying employer, that 501c3 or government agency organization. Non-PSLF doesn't matter, right? So if you work for a for-profit, this would be the group that we think about here. And then finally, how the taxes are treated. PSLF, tax-free forgiveness, huge benefit. Non-PSLF, at least as it currently stands, is not tax-free forgiveness, meaning anything that you would have left over to be forgiven at that future point, 20 to 25 years down the road. In that year, when you go to file your taxes, anything that's remaining to be forgiven would be treated as taxable income. So we have to be planning for that. Now, you might be wondering, why do I have these three boxes highlighted in yellow? Well, the current state of student loans is putting some questions around these three areas. So it's been pretty clear up until now that PSLF is eligible for these two groups, but there's some challenges that are happening through an executive order that I don't think are legally founded, but at least we got to pay attention to see where that goes, that are challenging potentially some individuals that work for a nonprofit, and are they 501c3 eligible? And then the repayment plans, I'll talk about this in the updates here in a moment. We used to have a broad inclusion and understanding that the repayment income-driven repayment plans as a whole would be eligible for PSLF, non-PSLF, and those are being challenged right now because of how those plans were created, and they weren't created equally. So IBR, income-based repayment, which is one of the income-driven repayment plans. Think of the term income-driven repayment as the umbrella term that describes several different types of income-driven repayment plans, such as IBR, ICR, pay, save, right? Those are examples of income-driven repayment plans. And one of those, income-based repayment or IBR, was established under the authority of Congress, and it holds a lot more legal weight than what we see with how other repayment plans were established, such as the SAVE plan. So stay tuned. I'll come back to that in a moment. Now, it's important we understand the formula. This is just one example. Each income-driven repayment plan is a little bit different, but this is an example for pay and new IBR of how the calculations work on the income-driven repayment to determine your monthly payment. Because if you understand the calculation, you can start to understand what are the levers that you might pull that will impact what your monthly payment is. And what you'll notice here on this calculation is that the main driver when it comes to the income driven repayment plans that determines what your monthly payment will be probably is no surprise because of the name income driven repayment, but it is your adjusted gross income or your AGI. So notice what's not on this slide. What's not on this slide is the total amount of debt that you have, right? It's your income that is a driver to determine your monthly payment. So let me show you a case study, just one example, not meant to apply again to your situation. Everyone's situation can be different, but a case study that highlights how PSLF may be very valuable. Now, there are risks. I'll talk about those risks here in a moment, but let's look at mathematically why PSLF might be so advantageous. So Adam, he's single, he makes $125,000. We're going to assume that's the same as his adjusted gross income for the sake of this case study. He works for a nonprofit in the great state of Ohio. He's got $160,000 of debt, 6% average interest rate. He has direct unsubsidized loans, and he has determined that his budget can afford up to $3,000 a month to put towards his student loans. Now, he probably doesn't want to pay $3,000 a month. I don't think anyone does. But this is an important question we have to answer to determine and to vet the different options that are available. What could the budget afford? So when I see this situation, unsubsidized direct loans, $160,000 working for a nonprofit, I'm thinking PSLF as a potential pathway. But you want to run these numbers yourself if you haven't already in the federal repayment estimator in your studentaid.gov profile. Again, we're talking about federal loans here. And when we do that, what we see is that for all of the different federal loan repayment options that we have available to us, which unfortunately there's more probably than we would like to have, which makes it difficult to choose. We should be able to see for each one of those, what's the first monthly payment? What's the estimated last monthly payment? How much is the total amount that you'd pay out of pocket? How much would be forgiven under PSLF? And then how long is the repayment period? And one of the things you'll notice here is because of how these plans differ in terms of length is the primary difference between these, as well as the percentage of multiplier that's used in the IDR calculation, but length of the loan plays a more important role. You'll see a big range, right? Not only in monthly payment, but also in how much you might pay out of pocket. So look at the range in monthly payment could be as low as 800 under the extended graduated, or as high as 1881, right? That's $1,000 a month difference. That's a big deal. Same thing, total amount paid out of pocket. It could be as low as 136 or as high as 336. That's a $200,000 difference of the amount that you pay over the life of the loan. This is worth your attention for that reason alone. So if we look at this in more detail, for Adam, assuming that he's comfortable, assuming he can meet the criteria, pursuing public service loan forgiveness under the Repay, which became the SAVE plan. So the Repay plan is no longer. SAVE plan is probably going away. So we'd have to look at other options. Or IBR new, which is the one that probably make the most sense. We see that it's not only going to give us an affordable monthly payment, right, in the 800s, but it's also going to lead to a low total amount paid out of pocket, 136,000, because of the PSLF eligibility of what would be forgiven and forgiven tax-free. Now, when you evaluate this for your own situation, it's one thing to get tax-free forgiveness. It's another thing to think about what else could I do with that money, right? Remember, Adam told us he's got $3,000 available per month towards his student loans. And I said he probably doesn't want to do that, right? But if he has that budgeted, and that number is really going to be closer to 900, will go up a little bit during the life of the loan. What if we took that difference between what he was budgeting and what he's going to be required to put because he wants to get as much forgiven and forgiven tax-free, and instead start to invest that money and really start to reap the benefits of the time value money? Here's the math that shows you kind of what happens, right? The resource available was at 3,000 in the budget. His actual payment is going to be between 890 where he starts, 1428 where he ends. If we split the difference between those two and subtract it from 3,000, we're left with about $1,800 a month. If we put that in a pretty boring high yield savings account, which is actually higher than 3% in most cases right now, that'd be another $250,000 at the end of 10 years. If we take on a little bit more risk and invest that in other places, over $300,000, right? So it's not just the amount forgiven and forgiven tax free. It's also what's the opportunity cost that we can do. Now, some of you are asking, well, what's the risk, right? I just shared kind of the upside. In my opinion, there's three risks. There's emotional risk, employment risk, and political risk, right? The emotional risk is just the uncertainty, especially right now with what's going on in the program, and that 10-year horizon and timeline. Now, the more debt you have, the more to be forgiven potentially under PSLF, the more beneficial the return on investment can come, right? The lower the debt load, especially if you're not willing to take on that emotional risk, it might just be easier to say, hey, let's pay these off. There's employment risk. What if you're no longer eligible or able to work for a qualifying employer? Maybe not likely, but could it happen? It could. And then I think there's political risk, which I'll wrap up with here as we talk about the current state. The current state of student loans mid-March, hot mess is the best word I can use to describe it, right? This is just a few of the articles I pulled from the last week that PSLF eligibility is under attack. The Department of Education cut its staff in half. Now they are executive order to shut down the department. Income-driven repayment applications, online applications are down, so people can't even make changes. They do have the paper application if you're willing to do that. And then I think by all measures, we see a challenge happening to the SAVE plan. And I'll talk about legally why that's happening. How did we get here, right? That's an important question. If we go back to the start of the pandemic, in March of 2020, we had a freeze, an administrative freeze on federal loans. And that lasted for almost 3 years until June of 2023, where there was no interest accruing on loans. And for those that were in active repayment, there was no payment that was due, and those were counting as qualifying payments towards PSLF. We then saw in June of 2023 that the Supreme Court struck down the Biden's proposal for debt cancellation up to $20,000 for certain borrowers. As a result of that, they came out with a new income-driven repayment plan called the SAVE plan as a response to that Supreme Court challenge. And most recently, we see a federal court injunction that's preventing the Department of Education, this is the most recent news, from implementing the SAVE plan and other parts of IDR plans. And most recently, there's an executive order that's challenging 501c3 status for public service loan forgiveness institutions. So what we know as of March, right? It's highly unlikely that the SAVE plan is making a comeback. I think that's being attacked. It was not legislatively enacted with the same security as something like we see with the IBR plan. There's a court-ordered block on that non-PSLF, the 20 to 25-year forgiveness under pay and ICR. The IDR applications are down. And then I mentioned that executive order that's really challenging institutions that don't align with some of the beliefs of the Trump administration to threaten, I think is the best way to put it, that those individuals might not be eligible for PSLF. Now, remember, it's an executive order. It doesn't have, it will be legally challenged if it were to be enacted. And so it's going to take some time to see how that's going to shake out. So what are some considerations? What the heck do I do with all this, right? Again, can't it reiterate enough? This is evolving by the day. So this is as of middle of March, and I want you to make sure you're getting the most up-to-date information at studentaid.gov. If you're in SAVE forbearance pursuing public service loan forgiveness credits, since you're not getting those while you're in the SAVE forbearance, it's nice that there's no interest, no payments. Consider, keyword, a move to an eligible IDR plan that will activate your payments, and you're going to have to do a paper application right now, but that would get us towards those PSLF credits. If you're in SAVE forbearance pursuing non-PSLF, consider movement towards the IBR. If you're in SAVE forbearance and you're not pursuing forgiveness, then I think it's hey, be patient and ride out the pause and the chaos and see what happens, right? And hopefully it goes without saying that not the time to be DIYing or hearsay from colleagues because of all of the changes that are happening. So that's a brief update, a lot going on, more questions than we have answers. I hope you'll connect with us on our website, on our podcast, and our newsletter. If you're not already, check it out, yourfinancialpharmacist.com, and you can continue to get more updates, not only on student loans, but also other parts of the financial plan. Thanks so much for listening to this session. I hope you have a great rest of your day.